let's dive into some research. We hear a lot about genetic research, but we also hear that very few Parkinson's cases are considered genetic. Can you break down genetic risk and talk us through why researchers emphasize large-scale genetics and data sharing efforts?
Yeah, sure. So really exciting question, and one that's near and dear to my heart. As you mentioned, I work on a couple genetics projects, and that's one of the things I lead at the foundation. So genetics, of course, are key not only to Parkinson's, but also to every other aspect of our biology. So you may be aware that you can go and you can get genetic testing for some conditions. Some of those are very, very clear answers. You go in, you take a test, and you get a result, and that result tells you whether you have a risk factor for a disease. With Parkinson's, we know that there are not so many very strong genetic predictors, right? And overall, if we look at every patient who's diagnosed, perhaps 20% of people have a known genetic risk factor. So that's actually quite low compared to some other diseases. If you look at a disease like Huntington's, these are diseases where if you are positive for those genetic risk factors, you're extremely likely to develop the disease, and it's a question of when. With Parkinson's, there are people who have these genetic markers and they may never go on to develop disease. So it's important to understand that when you hear about genetic testing for Parkinson's. But it's also important to understand that in addition to clinical testing, genetics it provides us with an incredible tool for how we can really apply biological research to ask questions. And when I say that, what I mean is genetics provides us this roadmap, this blueprint, right? And it allows us to go back and start understanding how these different systems work together in our body, how they may go wrong in disease. And so when we find that there's a new genetic risk factor that's identified, and that's part of the purpose of the Global Parkinson's Genetics Program you mentioned, this is just a starting point. And it means that we can then go back, we can dive into that biology, and we can start asking experimental questions about that biology. And that's how we really get things into the clinical pipeline. So that's a really exciting piece of what we do. So yeah, it's important to remember that there's a lot of different forms of genetic risk for Parkinson's. It's not just one. That can really tell people a little bit about how it may affect others in your family, but it also can tell us a little bit more about how you may be developing Parkinson's, how other people might be at risk for Parkinson's, and again, help us frame that downstream research that's so important.